Okay, welcome everyone back to the Mainline broadcast, our new live edition show that we have rolled out in the past month. My name is Asia Arnold. I'm the founder and publisher of Mainline and acting as today's host. For our discussion today in this episode, we are covering the updates on the ongoing City RICO case in Atlanta. And I'm joined by Atlanta based investigative reporter and researcher Sam Barnes, and as well as Josh Lingsch, who is one of the defense attorneys on the case in the City RICO and a defense attorney in Atlanta, and the one and only Reverend Keyanna Jones Moore, who is a community organizer, speaker, air shifter at WRFG Radio, phenomenal Reverend, and a member of the Mainline team as well. Very excited to be back with Keyanna on our show. We also used to do a show together called Finding Out at WRFG. You all should tune into her show, The Crossroads, which is now on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Eastern on WRFG, which is 89.3 FM if you're in the vicinity of Atlanta, or WRFG.org if you are not and you want to stream. So yeah, thank you all for joining today to talk about this story and this case that has been going on since, we could say before August 2023, but it was August 2023 when 61 people were officially indicted by the Georgia Attorney General on racketeering and conspiracy charges. There's also some domestic terrorism and arson involved in this indictment. It's quite a sweeping, massive indictment. One of the likes that I think has not really been seen in U.S. history. And it really rocked the Stop Cop City movement, but it also has like huge implications and has raised tons of concerns around First Amendment speech and protesting against authoritarianism. So we're going to dig into all of that. But first, I wanted to ask Sam for you to update us on the things that happened in the courtroom last week, as you were the person that was in the courtroom. And we worked together on an article via Mainline that readers can check out on our website. But if you don't mind, please update telling us what you noticed in the courtroom and saw.
Yeah, excuse me. So two kind of categories of takeaways from last week's hearings. One, the vibes, which I think we'll address later. First, I want to kind of provide just like the facts of where the case stands now and what's going to happen. So it had been scheduled to be a whole week of hearings on pre-trial motions for just the first trial grouping of, gosh, someone correct me here, the first four or five defendants. And instead, Tuesday morning, Judge Farmer came out after a 10-minute break that turned into close to a 30-minute break and stated that, well, I think we can all agree that the motion that I just heard was pretty dispositive, disproving of the case. And he announced his intent to, because of that motion, dismiss, at minimum, count 1 of the indictment, which is the racketeering charges. Most likely the third count, arson, is also likely going to get dismissed in the same manner, which leaves the issue of the DT charges. Now, the motion that was so disproving of the case is honestly a pretty simple and, to my eyes, a pretty niche, kind of genius argument, which is that in order for the Georgia Attorney General's office to have jurisdiction over a RICO case in which the state is not a victim, quote unquote, the Attorney General's office has to get permission, authorization, or be ordered to undertake that RICO prosecution by the governor of Georgia. And Deputy Attorney General John Fowler admitted in court, when asked by the judge, we didn't do that. He attempted to argue that they didn't need it, that because of 2 circumstances or situations in the indictment that, well, the state is therefore a victim in the case. And Judge Farmer did not buy those arguments. And it's similar with the arson charges. AG only has jurisdiction if they ask permission. They did not ask permission. Arson charges are likely to be dismissed as well. But most of the conversation and the particular motion at hand, I believe, mostly focused on discussing the racketeering charges. As of the time we're going live and recording this, he has not issued an order Judge Farmer has not issued a ruling finalizing the dismissal of at least count 1, the racketeering charges. But that's not really a surprise. This is an incredibly complicated, and Farmer discussed this in court, precedent-setting ruling on his part. So to people like me who sit in courtrooms a lot, other legal watchers, it's not really a surprise that he hasn't issued a ruling yet, but obviously defendants in the community are anxious for him to go ahead and write it and issue a ruling already. Unless you have any questions about that, I can go ahead and quickly summarize what's going on with the domestic terrorism charges.
So, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that would be a great explainer too.
So neither the defense nor Judge Farmer, nor of course the state, the prosecution, are really trying to argue that the Attorney General's office did not have jurisdiction to bring the domestic terrorism charges. Everyone seems to acknowledge or agree that, yes, the Attorney General's office is legally able to bring these domestic terrorism charges. Additionally, Farmer heard arguments about the domestic terrorism charges on other grounds, mostly that the Georgia's 2017 domestic terrorism law is unconstitutional in a couple of different ways. One is a really cool argument involving Georgia's General Assembly not following proper legislative procedure. I'll spare you all the nitty-gritty of that. It's very legislative nerdy. Hit me up if anyone wants to hear about it, because I think it's super cool. And others that go more towards the heart of the bill, which is the ways that it's like overly broad in terms of broad and vague about, well, at what point does buying a bouncy house raise to the level of funding terrorism, domestic terrorism, you know? Arguments that the law is overly broad and overly vague. So, and again, Farmer hasn't issued a ruling yet. Soon, but probably not any minute now, is when I think the ruling is likely to come down. Where the case is now, obviously we're waiting for the rulings. John Fowler, Deputy Attorney General, the Attorney General's office, said in court immediately when Farmer said he was likely to dismiss at least the racketeering charges, we will be appealing this in court, into a higher court, the Court of Appeals. That's not even a question. It is going to happen by all accounts. Obviously, they can't appeal until Farmer issues the ruling, and there's also a lot of legal procedural stuff, nitty-gritty stuff about how exactly Farmer will dismiss the charges, because Farmer did raise the question in court, well, because of the way the indictment is structured, even though you clearly had the authority to bring the domestic terrorism charges, and aside from the defense's arguments about the domestic terrorism law's constitutionality, you know, he sort of raised that he was debating the issue in his legal head. Well, maybe the domestic terrorism charges just need to be thrown out anyway, because they're intrinsically linked to the racketeering charges, and if the racketeering charges got to get thrown out, maybe that sort of spoils the domestic terrorism charges too. So he could throw out the whole indictment. He could throw out just count one, just counts 1 and 3, any number of different mix and match options here. But no matter what that looks like, the state is going to appeal this to the Court of Appeals.
I want to pivot to Keyanna and Josh real quick before coming back to you, Sam, to talk more about your reactions to this. But I'm curious, immediate reactions, Josh or Keyanna, whichever one of you wants to go first, to this development in this, what's been a very long and grueling case. This case has been dragging on for over 2 years, and we're still left with a lot of question marks and like waiting on rulings. The legal process is not a fast one. So whichever one of you wants to react first, would love to hear your reactions.
I think Josh deserves to be able to react to this first because he's been doing a lot of work on this.
Thank you. So, I mean, it is fitting kind of, right? You know, this case has dragged on for years at this point. There hasn't been any sort of clarity. There hasn't been a lot of developments. And for it to sort of get this dismissal based off of, you know, the ruling that Farmer made in court is kind of fitting, because really all they needed to do was get authorization from the governor in order to prosecute this case, and they didn't. And that is like emblematic of kind of their approach to the whole thing, which has been, you know, kind of haphazard, not really well thought out, or it doesn't seem like there's any sort of plan, really. They're just flying by the seat of their pants. But, you know, obviously it's a great thing. Just, you know, with this ruling, of course, it's going to go up on appeal. And then it's like, okay, now will the Court of Appeals agree? Will they disagree? And then, you know, even then it has a chance to go even higher to the Georgia Supreme Court. You know, if either side disagrees with the ruling of the Court of Appeals. So it is a great, you know, victory in the sense that the case is not going to be proceeding in the Superior Court, but the fight is not over, so to speak.
Definitely happy to have heard this, but haphazard was also the word that came to my mind in thinking about the Attorney General's case, honestly. Haphazard. And I think that what's shown here is that so many times when the state, broadly the state, whether it is your municipal government, state government, federal government, when there's a level of overreach because of wanton prosecution that is fueled by political repression, there are going to be simple things that will be missed. And haphazardly, because they did something very reactionary in thinking, oh my goodness, we just have to shut this movement down. You know, we remember those emails that were leaked from the Atlanta Police Foundation to people within the administration of the city of Atlanta and the police department talking about how they have to charge these protesters with something in order for this project to proceed. So when you think about that, you think about how haphazardly and how quickly the state responded, but they responded in a way that was not in line with proper prosecutorial procedure as it relates to these RICO charges, as it relates to the domestic terrorism charges. Again, you have legislation that is overly vague, broad, and non-specific that's being used. And it's much like RICO in itself. It makes me think about District Attorney Fani Willis's statement that she loves RICO. And in that interview where she made that statement, she was saying, basically, I use RICO because I can get people with RICO if I can't get them with anything else. And I think that it reveals a level of partiality when it comes to how the district attorney and the attorney general decides to deal with certain defendants. I think about the RICO trial of the Atlanta public school teachers. The state wasted so much money. That was the longest trial in the history of the state of Georgia and most expensive. And here we got another sweeping RICO indictment of 61 people with charges that were truly unfounded as it relates to RICO. And a lot of the things that were brought up were frivolous. Sam mentioned a bouncy house. You know, people were indicted for RICO conspiracy charges because they got reimbursed for meals or because they bought crazy glue or paper or, you know, construction supplies, all of these things that people do on a normal daily basis. But somehow, because the state decided we have to paint these protesters as particularly dangerous, so we're going to throw the domestic terrorism charges in here. We're going to throw these RICO charges in here. We're going to constantly misuse the word terrorist to describe them, to deter other people from expressing dissent against the militarization of local police departments. But what we see here, because we know that Cop City here in Atlanta is a test case. This is the test case for the entire nation. For one, how easily can we militarize local police departments? Two, how can we manufacture consent for a level of surveillance that would make this okay? And three, how can we get people to be okay with criminalization of people based on things that they wouldn't have been criminalized before? So when we think about this, as other parts of the movement where there are cop cities being built and proposed are studying the things that we're doing, what we see is that the freedom of speech and expression and association that was chilled by the initial indictment of these 61 defendants through RICO, that chill can thaw out now, because it might seem like it, you know, is a reason to make people stop what they're doing. But you see that everybody is not going to fall for the okie doke, that there's going to be some place where someone is going to have the courage to say, this wasn't right. You didn't do this properly. This doesn't constitute RICO. So it gives people hope within movement, people who are fighting against other militarized police training facilities and who are expressing dissent against authoritarianism, that it's okay to do what you're doing, that you really should not stop doing what you're doing, because the state can try to criminalize you, but somewhere the buck is going to stop.
I want to ask you, Keyanna, because you said you were in Geneva for a very important meeting and human rights conversation while you were there having the conversation. This news hadn't occurred yet, but can you tell us more about that trip? And like you said that before we were recording, that you actually were discussing with folks and members about this particular indictment before or as this development was happening. What is the connectivity that you see in between this RICO indictment and other human rights issues, not only in the US, but globally? And I know this is not your first time going to Geneva. You've been going to talk to people at the UN about Tortuguita, who was murdered by the Georgia State Patrol in the forest. I want to underline that Tortuguita was violently killed by police in the Bulanis People Park area of the forest, not the Cop City construction site, which was often misreported at the time. But please tell us about that journey at this meeting and the connectivity overall that you see.
Yes, so I traveled to Geneva again this year for the pre-session of the Universal Periodic Review. By now, it's been reported by a few media outlets that the United States has declined to participate in the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which takes place in November. Fortunately, the pre-sessions are held to give members of civil society who may not be able to travel in November the opportunity to present their case about human rights in the nations where they live. I traveled with a delegation of other civil society members from the United States, where we uplifted everything from First Amendment rights to rights of women and children, immigration rights, LGBTQ plus rights, reproductive justice, and all of the things, right, that we deal with. My report in particular, because it focused on First Amendment right violations and civil and human rights being violated, I had the opportunity to remind those member states that we had at the time 61 people in the state of Georgia who were being charged with RICO simply for protesting the construction of a militarized police training facility. I was able to point to the metastasizing terrorism framework for the basis of domestic terrorism charges for people doing things like sleeping in a hammock within the forest. I was able to point to the fact that Tortuguita was murdered as they sat cross-legged by police for occupying the forest that they wanted to clear to build Cop City. As I spoke to member states in Geneva, the expressions that I saw were those of disbelief, because as I talked about terrorism and the use of domestic terrorism against US citizens for simply expressing dissent, they almost appear to be baffled that this is a tactic that's being used by the United States. The report that I gave this year built upon a report that I gave in 2023 to the International Council on Civil and Political Rights that talked about the US moving toward authoritarianism, essentially. This report that I gave this year focused on the fact that where we are right now as it relates to civil, human, and political rights is that we are entrenched in authoritarianism. And this RICO indictment is one of those things that shows how it is that the state will exercise overreach in an authoritarian way to simply quench freedom of speech, to quell protests, to chill freedom of association and movement, and to, in their case, they think it's going to effectively stamp out a movement. But it was also a way for me to remind the world that we've seen this before in the United States, that the 60s were a time where there was mass political unrest, particularly because of world events that the United States took part in. And it gave me an opportunity to connect the dots here with everything that's happening in the global South, even as it relates to the destruction of land, the chilling of free speech, and the authoritarian regime that is ruling Palestine at this point. So going to Geneva was something that I thought was essential, because one thing that we can't do is let the world forget what's happening. We can't let people think that this government is doing anything to help us when they're really not. The state of authoritarianism that we're in is something that I don't think anyone in the world was prepared for. And my report and statement were very comprehensive. I touched on a number of things, particularly the overly bloated counterterrorism and defense budget of the United States. And surveillance went into that a lot. And I think that when we talk about Cop City, we cannot talk about Cop City without uplifting the fact that the level of surveillance caused by things like Cop City mirrors that of what's being done to Palestine by the state of Israel.
Thank you, Keyanna. And I want to circle back to this in a moment, but I want to kick it back to Josh because Sam had mentioned a very particular motion that triggered this, what, assumingly will be the formal ruling from Farmer, how he decides to rule that officially. But can you tell us about this specific motion and your thoughts about it? I'm also curious what you think about the arguments the defense was making more broadly about the Georgia domestic terrorism statute, by which 5 people were indicted with domestic terrorism. You're muted. If you can unmute.
Sorry about that. So yeah, the motion was filed by Thomas Jurgens' attorney. He's the legal observer that was arrested for I don't know what organization he was with, but essentially, I mean, it's very straightforward in that the Georgia Constitution gives district attorneys the ability to prosecute cases in each circuit, essentially. The Attorney General does not have that same sort of authority, but for these exceptions that are noted in the statute, like domestic terrorism, it does have a sentence about there being concurrent jurisdiction between the district attorney and the AG, which means either one of them can bring a prosecution for that particular charge. The attorney here essentially did a little bit of a deep dive into what sort of authority the attorney general actually had to bring a RICO indictment, specifically counts 1 and 3. And apparently, upon research, they need authorization from the governor, which they admitted that they did not receive and conceded that it would have been easy to do so. So based upon that, I think Judge Farmer really didn't have any other choice but to dismiss the counts that the Attorney General did not have the authorization to bring, which would be 1 and 3. The remainder of the indictment would be the domestic terrorism charge, which covers 5 of the 61 defendants. So essentially, there were arguments made that the statute does not define the terms that it gives in terms of what is critical infrastructure, what is major monetary loss or damage. These are things that usually, lawmakers will put in, a definition section that precedes the statute, or at least give people a better idea of what that means in terms of, thinking about what a jury has to decide. Are they going to be able to understand what critical infrastructure is, or major economic loss, which Fowler was arguing, John Fowler was arguing essentially should be a question of the jury, but it's a really difficult question if you were to pose it to a jury, because for the city of Atlanta, what is a major economic loss? John Fowler said, $50,000 could be considered major, but in the context of a budget of millions, does that constitute major? What is critical infrastructure? At the time that many of these individuals were arrested, there was nothing built in the forest. So what type of critical infrastructure would be covered under that, or what are they referring to if nothing was built at the time? So the remaining question is, will the domestic terrorism count stand alone essentially, or will it be dismissed along with counts 1 and 3? And Michael Schwartz, who represents one of the 5 who is covered by the domestic terrorism count in the indictment, essentially made arguments that it should be dismissed along with the other 2 for the reasons that I previously mentioned about the uncertainty regarding the terms. And also, there are questions as to whether they met the required elements of the domestic terrorism statute to begin with, and whether it can stand alone with the other 2 charges getting dismissed since they're so interrelated. So as it stands now, we're sort of waiting on Judge Farmer in terms of, is he going to dismiss the entire indictment? Is he going to leave count 2? And we don't necessarily have an answer as to that, but obviously the hope is that the entire indictment will go.
I want to add as well that Thomas Jurgens is the attorney who has been charged in the RICO indictment, and he is an attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Sherry Boston, the DeKalb County district attorney, actually said that this was actually like a huge touchstone of like why she refused to prosecute these cases back in the day in 2023. She said this, and it was actually the prosecution of Thomas Jurgens, the staff attorney with SPLC, that was like, he was one of the 23 people charged after being arrested at the South River Music Fest, which is where the bouncy house incident occurred, which like Keyanna and Sam both touched on. So I wanted to like uplift that and also shed light on how this case has been so like, there's been other even prosecutors that are just saying like, I don't want to go anywhere near this case, you know? So I'm curious, Sam, like you've been reporting on this story as well since the get. What was it like for you to hear this development? And essentially what it appears to me is that it's almost like a technicality, not like a moral issue, that it is like starting the domino effect. What is your reaction to that about this prosecutorial authority technicality kind of being the thing that could very well bring the whole house of cards down for the attorney general?
I mean, when on a surface level, I was definitely surprised just because no one in their right mind expected Farmer to issue a bench rule, any kind of bench ruling this week, and he fell short of actually doing that. He formalizing it in that way, and Farmer himself in sort of a glib comment, I think Monday, because this happened on Tuesday, said, don't expect any bench rulings this week. I don't think he expected to issue any bench rulings. So in that sense, yeah, it was the fact that he got this close to actually issuing a bench ruling on this motion, I think speaks to how strong the motion was. Now, in terms of it coming down to a technicality, it checks out, you know? I mean, this case has, we're 2 years in. Like, in my writing, I have had to go back and correct myself where I sort of just sort of unthinkingly write the Cup City trial, because you can't call it a trial because we're 2 years in and we haven't had a trial yet. We've had one jury in the case of Isla King, which due to a speedy trial motion filing is somewhat separate from the rest of the defendants. We've had one jury, and that jury got dismissed.
That's a whole other mess.
Yeah.
Another can of worms.
But that's the only jury that has been seated in this case 2 years in. We have had charges previously dismissed, the money laundering charges against some of the folks from the Atlanta Solidarity Fund dismissed. The previous judge in the case, Judge Adams, upon finding out that the prosecution had not only obtained but reviewed, and that most likely reviewed, we don't really know for sure, and then shared attorney-client privileged materials from some of the defendants with all the other defendants. She said the prosecution of gross negligence, gross misconduct was just like used very strong language to describe the conduct of the Attorney General's office in this case. It checks out. Yeah.
This was the vibe.
So what we're looking at here is, I don't know her exact title, but she's an attorney that works for the Attorney General's office. She's sitting second chair next to John Fowler on the case. Hallie Dixon, attorney for the state, Hallie Dixon, in response to being quite harshly roasted by Judge Kevin Farmer after a very long day in court, and the entire courtroom breaking out in laughter. And then she just sort of turned away from Farmer so that Farmer wouldn't see her laughing, or sort of, anyway, yeah. She had a rough couple days there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think she was on a hot mic a couple of times, right?
Yeah. Yeah, let's we've talked about the serious stuff, and I do want to really, really underscore Josh's point that, like, this is like another legal, I don't want to say defeat, but like chip in the armor of the strength of the state's case here. But this is not over yet. These charges have not been dismissed. It's unclear if like what the status of like bond conditions and stuff will be while the appeal is pending, which is likely to be a 6, 8, 10 month process, maybe a little bit shorter because that's such a high profile case, but it's not a short process. The day after Farmer announced his intent to dismiss at least the racketeering charges, supporters held a block party outside of the Fulton County Courthouse, closely watched by a number of Fulton County's finest, who were very upset that journalists were standing in the shade and then blocked up. Anyway, this so isn't over yet, and the defendants are all still facing a lot of precarity in their daily lives because of these charges. But also, you have to have joy in your life. You have to have something to laugh at. And boy, did the state, the prosecution, and Judge Kevin Farmer provide Monday through Wednesday, especially Monday, during the pretrial motions hearing. If you haven't had the pleasure of reading this, like, how many hundreds of pages is the indictment? A lot of pages. If you haven't had the pleasure of reading the indictment, you may not be familiar with the first, I think, 25 pages of count 1 of the indictment, which have been laughable as soon as the indictment came out. Like, everyone was like, what the hell is this history of anarchism that refers to things as far afield as, like, Aleppo in Syria or Mexican Zapatistas or this, that, and the other. Anyway, during a hearing on a motion in regards to, like, that part of the indictment, Judge Kevin Farmer did, in fact, refer to these 25 pages as a bad political science paper, stating it's a bad political science paper. It has problems over the sad protestations of either Fowler or Attorney Dixon.
Those paragraphs about mutual aid and social solidarity.
Yeah, which can be seen right here.
And zines, the dastardly zines that domestic terrorisms are producing.
Sorry, Josh, I didn't mean to cut you off. Kind of the heart of Farmer's, I don't want to say objection because that's a legal term here, but kind of the problems Farmer had with this part of the indictment was that it's the first 25 pages of count 1. It is not a long rambling introduction. All of this history of anarchism and invoking all these other insurgent or anarchist movements, it's part of the part where they describe the criminal act, which the motion that this was discussed during, Farmer pointed that out and said, well, you say, because, I think the quote from Deputy AG Fowler was something like, Your Honor, this indictment is about not what they believe, but what they did. And Farmer held up the indictment and said, but you've got 25 pages of a bad political science paper about political speech, about anarchism, about political beliefs, and you made that part of the crime. So I think that motion is honestly mooted by oh no, Asia. I'll just keep going. I think that part of that motion is probably mooted by what happened on Tuesday with the procedural stuff with the Attorney General's office. I don't know if it's even still live right now because Asia's gone. But I'll just keep sharing some of my favorite memories from those 2.5 days. And please, anyone else, feel free to jump in.
I think you should. I'm only going to interject right here that those first 25 pages shows that people were in fact criminalized for their beliefs and for their thoughts. But nobody is standing trial because they say that they are a born again Christian, or because they say, well, they are standing. Some people are standing trial because they say that they identify as Muslim, but Christian nationalists are not being criminalized and on trial for those beliefs, right? And people who go into houses of worship, typically on a Sunday, have a very strong set of beliefs that cause them to act in a certain way, but they're not being criminalized for that. And I think that this shows that fascism is really here, and that our state, our government is firmly rooted in it and is showing us what it looks like to live in a fascist state in real time, where you are going to be criminalized for your beliefs if your beliefs are not what the state thinks they should be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I also have been going back to just like one fact about Cop City, which is that this land grab, which is how I describe it, is like, but this deal, this lease, like 381 acres of land for $500, right from the Atlanta Police Foundation, is like the terms of the agreement. The lease agreement says, $50 a year for 10 years for all of this land for the purposes of constructing Cop City. And we all have been covering this, researching it, investigating it since that day that Joyce Shepard, the then council member of District 12 in Atlanta, introduced the paper to authorize this ground lease agreement on the city council floor. That was on June 7th, 2021. We've all been in it since then. And so there's so many things about Cop City that are problematic. And unfortunately, it was so fast that there hasn't been, I think people have been, problematizing, the very existence of Cop City itself. But I always go back to the illegitimacy of Cop City even existing in this deal. So it's always kind of ironic for me to hear the state's arguments that I think apply to the state itself. If there's a organized conspiracy in action, I view the Atlanta Police Foundation, the Atlanta Committee for Progress, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Atlanta Police Department, and city officials and politicians organizing very effectively to make sure that Cop City was built by any means necessary. And the violence that has ensued because of it, with the police, the killing of Tortuguita, who was gunned down in the forest that day in January 2023, not to mention the increased harassment of residents that live near Cop City, which Mainline has covered with local community members that have experienced it. This RICO indictment was an act of state violence as well. The 61 people indicted very wide. I could go on and on and on, but I think it also relates to this global pattern that we see in international politics and international law, what we're seeing in Palestine as well, which is that states that are engaging in what we might define as terrorism behavior or violent, actions are the ones in power that are able to point the finger at
I'm pretty sure that if Asia was still talking, she would be saying that these states are the ones who are able to point their finger at others. Because how ironic is it that the United States has refused to participate in the Universal Periodic Review, but just weeks before we got that news in Geneva, the United States was talking about other countries and their records on human rights. Like, what gives you the authority when the Trump administration pulled out of the Human Rights Committee to the tune of owing them $1.5 billion? So part of my statement at the pre-session was, are you going to stand by and let this dude jerk you around like this? Like, are you going to let this one person decide, one, that an entire nation gets to skirt by with human rights violations that will go unaddressed and unchecked? But two, are you going to let him just say, you know what, to hell with the Human Rights Committee? We're not doing that, but do it while owing you money? So, okay, what you're proving now is that you are extremely afraid of the United States and you're extremely afraid of Israel. The two combined are like the world's superpower that other nations just don't want to go against. And what I'm saying to the people at the pre-sessions when I was there, what I was saying was, are you going to stand by or are you going to stand up? Just let me know. You're going to stand by or are you going to stand up? Because somebody's got to stand up. And I would like for it to be you. But if you're not going to, then please just move aside. Don't even stand by. Just move aside.
Money is the, as always, the most obvious litmus test for these things. Because while you were talking, Keyanna, I was reminded that two of the city council members that are well known to be the biggest like fiscal hawks of the city council, Howard Shook, who is set to retire in the next few months, and Alex Wan, who is kind of following in his legacy in terms of the finance committee and everything. Both of them were quite opposed to Cop City because it's a bad deal for the city. Like, obviously I reject these terms, but there's arguments that if the city of Atlanta were to sell the land that Cop City is on, they could get a hell of a lot better deal than $500, $50 over 10 years. The price has repeatedly gone up. The amount that the city is on the hook for has repeatedly been misrepresented to both council and taxpayers. Although I think most council members would have had a better understanding of it if they were a little bit more curious about the project. But I think I don't want to get into things I may or may not remember about council votes from 3 years ago, but ultimately both of them approved it, even though they, especially as funding continues to come up and need to go to APF for Cop City. Juan in particular has been quite vocal about, well, is this the best deal? You said it was already going to cost this. Where's this money going for? What's this money going towards? But ultimately they voted to approve Cop City because they feel that their political future depends on the support of the ungodly powerful Atlanta Police Foundation and all of its allies. And like I really have come to quite respect Howard Shook in particular for his sort of political independence and making the best financial decisions for the city as I've watched city council over the years. And he's listening to him talk on other issues. He's not someone I would have especially aligned myself with, but even he, this like a legendary, notorious fiscal hawk in the city of Atlanta, made the calculus that I better just vote in favor of this. And these were people that frankly were in favor of a police training center, even one like this. But this goes back to kind of what Asia has been saying. Like, there's so many reasons to be opposed to Cop City.
Lots of reasons to be opposed. As Asia talked about, the people who are the conspiratorial machine that have pushed this through, I can't help think about the complicity of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals as it relates to the referendum for Cop City. You know, my co-plaintiffs and I are still waiting on a decision. We do not have a decision. And it boggles my mind.
It's been 2 years now, right?
For all this time, no decision. And it's gotten bounced around. And the very last thing that we heard from the court was, well, you know, Cop City is built now. Do y'all still want to proceed with this? We responded through our attorneys. It is clear that we want to proceed, but we've heard nothing from the court. There's not even a scheduled court date.
Yeah.
To hear briefs, motions, anything. There's nothing. And I cannot help but believe that somewhere within that system, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals was content to just sit where it sat and do nothing, to watch it all play out so that we would not get a decision. Because at the end of the day, I believe that anyone who truly pays attention can feel that the majority of people who could vote in a referendum would vote against Cop City being built. And what that signals in our case is that the same people who talk about the Republican Party and voter suppression and all of that stuff are willing to engage in it themselves as long as it benefits them. So when I look at a mayor like Mayor Andre Dickens and council members who will sit by and allow for people's right to vote to be taken away, you can't help but think that all of these people are involved in the conspiracy, that they are all okay with being vote suppressionists and with understanding. They're willing to live with the understanding that people should have had a right to vote on this, and they took it away. They're okay with having Cop City there, even with all of its issues. They don't care that the flooding in that area has increased 10 times. They don't care because they got what they wanted. Because after all, at the time, President Joe Biden was saying that Cop City in Atlanta is the model for the nation. And what have we seen? We've seen other states follow suit. So I hope that as other states are following suit, that the resistance in other states will follow suit as well and don't stop what they're doing.
Yeah. And also, like, all the more reason to continue covering what's happening with this RICO case, because there's Atlanta influences everything for like better or for worse, apparently. So it's like Cop City, like, there's a reason why I believe that Atlanta kind of was the first like major city for this modern day Cop City development. It's not that these types of Cop cities, although weren't called that, it's not like in the 60s there was, a similar facility where it was a mock city for cops to train and everything. Like, not saying it's completely new and unfounded, but for the modern day iteration of this with like a nonprofit, with police foundations being like a more modern trend to raise money, like this dark shadow money for police departments to become these massive militarization facilities. That's like one thing that I try to underline when I talk to people about Cop City is that like Public Safety and Training Center is a very sanitized branding of what this actually is. And everything that people opposed to Cop City have predicted has come true as a result of this facility existing. The most traumatic of which being the murder of Tortuguita. That was a prediction that no one ever wanted to come to fruition, but people said from the beginning that people were going to lose their lives and have their lives taken away because of the construction of this facility. It increased police presence, which is in a in this case, in a low-income, predominantly Black part of Atlanta. Joyce Shepard, who introduced this paper in 2021, represented the 12th district, which is like probably, I think, the poorest district in the city of Atlanta. And she wasn't the first council member that John Keane, who is an ex-military, suspected like pro, Trump leaning, city CFO or someone in Keisha Lance Bottom's administration. I can't remember his exact, like chief operator of like COO or something. He shopped this legislation around to a few council members. We found out, like, he went to a couple of other, like Jennifer Ide was one. I believe Carla Smith was another one. And they basically told John to go fuck himself. They were like, I'm not bringing this to the floor. Natalie Archibong, after it passed, went on King William's show to say all these things that would have been super helpful to hear her say before they passed the paper in September 2021. I remember all this so vividly. And Sam, you and I were in this together at the time. That summer was so intense for everyone.
Why?
But like, you and I were producing coverage together via Mainline at this time. So I just remember being very in it with you. Josh, I had not met you yet. And Keyanna, I also remember being in it with you as well. But yeah, like, sorry, it's just to go on and on to say that, Cop City started here because the Atlanta way is like a dynamic that has created this perfect storm for it to happen here. Now, what do we see? We see 77 plus similar facilities being planned, constructed, or presented to be built across the U.S. Why on earth is that necessary? 77 plus, that's more than one per state. That is more than one per state. Mm-hmm. That's the thing with Cop City is that, like, whether you think that, whether you're an abolitionist or not, if you even look at it from a purely like business standpoint, how is it necessary to spend this much money on a facility when they could have just like refurbished and remodeled the existing facility they were in? It just like never made sense. Even if you took the abolitionist viewpoint out of it, in my point of view, if you just looked at it from a purely like neutral standpoint, you could not justify it, but they manufactured so much justification. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution was like directly complicit with that egregious editorial op-ed that they ran when the community got it tabled in August 2021. And then the AJC paper hits that Sunday with like this horrible, like fear-stoking crime, like fear-mongering editorial saying like crime in Atlanta is so bad that we need this facility now.
How apropos for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, because what happened in the early 1900s in Atlanta that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution contributed to?
Yeah. I'm going to say, if you want to hear me go on and on and on about this, you should join our Mainline media trainings via the Patreon for just $10 a month. You can join like a community of organizers and journalists that are working together to, develop coverage from different angles to combat legacy media like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, whose parent company CEO, Alex Taylor, was literally the fundraiser for Cop City.
And now they've announced that they are no longer doing print, which is amazing. I love it.
Oh my God, Keyanna, have not had a chance to talk to you about that.
I'm so like tap dancing shoes, bells on, all the things, right? And also, Asia, I just wanted to piggyback off of what you said about the Atlanta way being the reason that this happened in Atlanta. I also believe that because of Atlanta's moniker as the Black Mecca, where it is widely held that Black people can get on easier in Atlanta than in other places and have better chances of having a good quality of life, I think they wanted to signal to people that this is not what it is, that you Black people don't need to get this idea in your head. And so we're going to do it here in Atlanta, because if this is the Black Mecca, the place where y'all are supposedly able to get on easier than in other places and you can thrive here, let us show you how we're going to keep you from thriving And that way, if it can't happen in Atlanta, then it's definitely not going to happen any other place. So, Chicago was actually the blueprint. Camp Grayling was the blueprint. And if we had been paying attention then, perhaps Atlanta wouldn't have been able to happen. But the country was literally in an uproar because of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many other people. And then locally, because of Rayshard Brooks and the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and so much that was going on in Atlanta. So we had just a perfect storm of confusion and fear that allowed for this project to get moved forward. But even when the ground lease was introduced and all these things, in the height of the pandemic, when people were not even coming out to in-person meetings, hours and hours and hours and hours of public comment via Zoom told to the Atlanta City Council that this is not what the people wanted. Imagine if people
17 hours.
17 to be exact. Yes.
Yeah.
Imagine if people could have shown up in person the way we were able to some years later, when we kept them there till 6 a.m. the next morning with so many hours of public comment. There's never been a doubt that the people at large do not want this. The people don't want Cop City, but the powers that be had already made their backdoor deals. Because anybody who thinks that the Atlanta City Council is really running the city of Atlanta, like, I don't know what you're smoking at this point. The Atlanta Police Foundation runs the city of Atlanta through the major corporations that fund it. For those people who think that police foundations are charitable organizations that benefit law enforcement officers, they do not. They are there strictly for the benefit of those corporations who give their money in order to have private paid security from the police department, because the police are here to protect their property and their profits, not here to protect or serve us as citizens. They are here for the corporations. And that's the reason why Georgia Power, Georgia Pacific, Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Delta, Dunkin' Donuts, and Baskin Robbins, all of these companies have such a vested interest in this because they are members of the Atlanta Police Foundation, and they have given heavily to the construction of Cop City just because they believe that it's going to be better for their bottom line.
The conspiracy. Like, it really is like, if you power map the whole thing around Cop City, you have everything you mentioned, the AJC, as we mentioned, Cox Enterprise, its parent company, and then also the Atlanta Committee for Progress. Josh?
Yeah, so something that I've heard thrown around is that RICO isn't just a criminal statute; it's a civil statute as well. And based off of the argument that y'all made, there is a compelling case that there was a conspiracy going on, just not how the state alleged, but with the people pushing Cop City forward in the face of so much opposition. That's an interesting legal argument, which I would want to see play out. But I think all of this is just a testament to the power of the Atlanta Police Foundation. And also I view, the proposal of Cop City and the timing that it came is a direct backlash to the uprisings in 2020, because Chicago did have a similar type of situation with No Cop Academy. And ultimately that one was built as well, but it didn't seem to have the national sort of spotlight and focus that Cop City did, which I think, was due in large part to the activation of folks to the sort of injustice, that gives rise to these types of facilities. And it's the same blueprint as they've been using for years and years and years, just, a new iteration of the police need better resources in order to better serve the community. But, we all know that that is not the case, and that's not the purpose for Cop City. It's to, suppress dissent. It's to be able to stop these sorts of uprisings before they even begin. and do it under the veneer of social justice.
I would love to see if anyone picked up a legal strategy to a civil RICO case. That would be very interesting.
I hope that someone sees this broadcast and does just that.
Yes. Well, we're coming up on time. So any like final words for this episode that y'all want to share before we sign off?
Yeah, I just want to say that in this particular case, we might be able to say that justice delayed isn't justice denied. But I think that the thing that I would hope people would walk away from all of this with, whenever it's all said and done, is that the power is always with the people. And even though an oppressive system might rise, it will never stand. So people should always resist.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And my heart, goes out to every single person who cared about this issue, who, contributed in whatever manner that they were able to oppose this facility and make their voice heard. And I hope the takeaway isn't that we shouldn't bother or we shouldn't try, because, this particular situation ended in a result that, we weren't hoping for, but rather, when we do join together and when we do, connect with one another to oppose these things, that it can at least, delay them. It can cause these people to think twice, and, try to learn from some of the failures that, we went through, in order to have success in the future.
I would just remind folks that Joyce Shepard, who introduced this legislation, Keyanna knows where I'm going. Joyce Shepard found out that fall, I believe either fall 2021 or maybe it was 2022. Joyce Shepard lost her seat on the Atlanta City Council.
Mm-hmm.
Just gonna leave that thought dangling. She introduced this stuff and then she did not win re-election. It's an unpopular project, to say the least.
I've always suspected, and I don't have anything concrete to share, but I always suspected that John Keane had something on Shepard because like other people were in a position to say no. I don't. That's just like a gut feeling, which is nothing I can report on really, but it's like one of that journalistic hunches of like, there's something really fishy about this. I would love to find out for sure. I think for me, like some of my final words for today is that I just like, there's so much interconnectedness and connectivity of what's happening in Atlanta and like what has come out of here. And I just like would really love to see more outlets like dedicating their resources to it. And I'm talking about like national outlets, and would love to like have a conversation about, possibly with Keyanna and like Jasmine, who is like another like mainline editor, to talk about the state of journalism right now, because what we're witnessing, particularly what's being wielded towards trans people right now through the weaponization of right-wing propaganda that is being consumed en masse through mainstream media and major social media platforms, is extremely disturbing. And I don't think it's disconnected from like the things that we're talking about. And I think what I have a fear of is that we're going to see more state-sponsored violence, like particularly towards trans community first, and to manufacture more consent for a fascist state. And more, I think the idea of like an appeals process is a little unnerving to me, just because it seems like that's another conversation. It's just that higher courts seem to be run by Trump that man. And so I think like the appeals process is a little unnerving for me in the moment, because what if a new president gets set? But I'm thinking so much about the trans community and Black community with the story of Trey Reed that came out in Mississippi. Want to like uplift Trey Reed, because mainstream media can't seem to take an ounce of breath for Trey Reed. Everyone's so busy talking about Charlie Kirk, and Jimmy Kimmel actually just got pulled from ABC because he was just stating facts about that case, about what happened. So we need to keep talking about the RICO, because it's very important for us to understand the anatomy of the oppression that's happening in order for us to fight it. And I just want to encourage everyone to continue supporting independent media, if it's, you know, not mainline, just like something in your locale, because we are literally living in the reality of like what happens when independent media is stamped out, and it's going to continue, and to protect and uplift trans people in your life, and to surround them with love in this moment, which this RICO indictment is very queer. There's a lot of queer and non-binary people in this indictment. So just want to like wrap them up with love as well. And it's not disconnected is what I wanted to say. So thank you all for coming on the show. This is going to be archived for people to view, for people that were not able to tune in with us. This is the middle of the workday. I recognize that, but this was the time that we could get all four of us in the room. So we are a working class, you know, scrappy little working class outlet here. So for those interested, please join our Patreon or the Substack. The Patreon, I think, is the most helpful. And I think the best tiers are the media training tiers. If you are someone who is eager to learn and connect with people we have people across the so-called US tuning in weekly, either live with us or later when we archive our trainings. And we have a whole archive of a training course Keyanna has been in as a guest facilitator to do teach-ins, and other amazing people. Those are all archived. So when you join the Patreon, you not only get to tap into the community that is like ongoing and the work that we're doing, but you get to access the entire archive of like every training that we have done since March of this year. So really worth it. You could even jump on, download all of them, and then leave. I just want people to have these tools. Like you could do that. Like it's fine. Like I just want people, it's literally a steal. We have so many experts from the movement journalism community and legal community that have come on to talk about very important issues, because we're going to be the ones to save the world. Like working class people, media makers, and artists, it's our time. So I just want people to have these tools. So thank you, everyone. And we will see y'all next time.
Thanks for having us.